Is anyone prepared for an early morning collect phone call from an inmate at the county jail, especially when the call comes from your mother, who's been arrested for shooting a man who dared to mess with her mango tree? And that is how The Mango Tree, a memoir of fruit, Florida, and felony by Annabelle Tometich begins. Welcome to Between the Covers. I'm Ann Bocock. Annabelle Tometich went from medical school reject to line cook to journalist to author, and we're glad she did. She spent 18 years as a food writer, editor, and restaurant critic. She is an award-winning writer, and her highly acclaimed memoir, The Mango Tree, a memoir of fruit, Florida, and felony, is beautifully written and one I could not put down. Welcome, Annabelle.
Thank you so much, Anne.
The story is beautiful. The story is complex. I mean, parts are heavy. This is a journey. It is your Filipino-American journey. You're navigating multiple cultures. And it also will resonate with anyone who has ever felt other than.
Right.
So let's start way back before you even came into the picture. We need to know your parents.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about your mother, Jo.
Yeah, so my mother, Josefina, is a central figure in this book. She was born in Metro Manila, and probably one of the poorest neighborhoods of Metro Manila, called San Andres Bukid. And I think from a very young age, she realized that she did not want to be there and that she wanted something better for herself and for her life. And from a young age, she also understood that to get that and to get out of Manila, she had to become a nurse, because there was a very robust nursing pipeline put in place by, America during their occupation of the Philippines in the early part of the 20th century. And that system allowed certain people to get into healthcare and come to the U.S. to kind of fill these jobs that, for whatever reasons, American workers weren't able to come in and take. So, yeah, that was the one side, this one, very Filipino side of me. And then I had this very white father who's from New England and who had a very different life than my mother, a very privileged and comfortable and safe and kind of just cushy life. And the two of them end up meeting at a hospital in Fort Myers, Florida, and
And that's where we're going to pick up the story.
Along. Yes.
From the first page, we see there are these issues of fitting in, issues of acceptance. There is a courtroom scene where you're looking around and you think, they are not like us. We are not like them. Right. Explain that.
Yeah, and kind of in that statement, I count myself in the we. I count myself in the do-gooders who are, on this one side of the courtroom bench, as opposed to the first appearance criminals or alleged criminals who are on the other side of the courtroom bench. And I am kind of seeing things as, my mother has broken the law and that makes her a bad person. And I am here trying to do the best I can as this good person to perhaps help her out or figure the situation out and move things forward for her. And I think throughout the course of the book and throughout the course of reflecting on, my family and my childhood and everything, I came to realize that there aren't those distinctions. Those distinctions aren't exactly real. So.
I would love to hear this in your voice, the way you wrote. And if you could read that passage, I believe it's on page 4.
Certainly. Yeah. So this is in the Lee County courtroom during my mother's first appearance hearing. When Mom called from jail that morning, I didn't freak out. If 35 years with my mother had taught me anything, it was not to freak out. I called my sister, my brother, that close friend of ours who's a defense attorney. I led with, Mom shot a man's car window out. I followed with, he was messing with her mangoes. They got it. I know Mom loves us in her own Josefina Tometich way. I'm equally certain she loves her mango trees, deeply, fondly, unabashedly. I'd put her banana trees in a close second for her tropical affections, followed by her atis, calamansi, avocado, and tamarind trees. If her pineapples are fruiting, that throws it all off.
If her pineapples are fruiting, that throws it
yes,
all off.
The equation's totally different.
At its core, this book is honest, and
Yes.
honesty can be painful.
Yes.
You write about your childhood home. There was anger, there was violence. Your mother's rage at times was all-consuming. What does this do to a child?
Oh, I know, right? I mean, and I think it can do a lot of things to a child. And I think, you know, maybe one of the things I didn't write as much about is kind of how these different tensions put different pressures on different members of the family. But as the eldest daughter, you know, the pressures that I faced were very specific and very different than what my siblings kind of had to deal with. And I think I'm very fortunate in a lot of ways to not have an addictive personality and to kind of fall into things that are relatively safe, socially speaking. But I was a very compulsive, very obsessive child. I have, throughout the book, there's an obsession with numbers and counting and trying to make this world add up that really did not add up in all these other different ways. And I think just as easily that obsession could have been drugs or alcohol or something much more, you know, deteriorating. And in a way, I think that's lucky. But yeah, I had to grow up. I had to grow up very, very early on. My father passed when I was 9. My sister was 5 years old. Our brother was 9 months old. And, you know, there was a big question mark of like, where do we go from here? And the answer was, you know, even more so than I already had been, I needed to step up and become that other parent in the house at you know, 10, 11 years old.
You know, truly more than just survival. You really did thrive, and it's you know, to your credit.
Thank you.
It's a remarkable book. Your grandmother, your father's mother, there's no other way to say it, she was a racist.
Oh yeah.
And there are words that I can't say on public television that she said. Writing this, did you look at it differently from the child's view than you do now as an adult? Do you see her
100%.
differently now?
100. Well, and for years and years, I didn't realize she was racist. She was grandma, you know? Like, I never ever realized. I remember the first time I heard the word microaggression. I think it was after college or in college, sometime around then. I was like, microaggressions, and those, you know, these little slights that you hear and that you kind of internalize, and that aren't overt forms of racism, but are these gentle digs of racism that just kind of stick with you for all these years. And the examples they were giving, I was like, that's just how my grandmother would talk to me every single day. Like, there was no realization as a kid that that was what was going on. And then, you know, so I grew up with this very kind of innocent idea of my grandmother, and, you know, she lost her son and she died when I was fairly young. And then as an adult, it was like this flip-flop of like, oh my gosh, grandma was racist. Like, grandma, you know, she didn't just hate my mother because my mother was my mother. She hated my mother because she was brown and because she saw my mother as diluting her bloodlines, you know? And that's kind of oh my goodness, you know? And then you start thinking of yourself in all these different ways of like, if I internalized all of that as kindness and goodness, then like, what else have I internalized as kindness and goodness that is in fact not such thing? So yeah, there were a lot of revelations that came about that I really hadn't considered before kind of sitting down to put all this together. And that was a huge one.
You mentioned your father. Your father died when you were 9.
Yes.
And you wrote something that I had to underline, and it said, I knew my dad for only 9 years. I often wonder if I'm remembering him or Magnum P.I., whose 8th season overlapped neatly with Lou Tometich's fatherhood.
Yes.
And I read it and I underlined it and I said, that is a power, even saying it now, that did a number on me.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, when I try to like pull up images of my dad, like they are sometimes images of Magnum P.I. You know, there's sometimes Tom Selleck is there and I'm like, no, that's not your father. And I'll have to look at pictures sometimes because I was so young when he passed. And I think part of this book and part of, you know, once I started writing it, because I did not set out to write a memoir, first of all. Like, I would never, ever set out to write a memoir. I thought it was going to be a cookbook. And I thought it would be a cookbook with these, like, quirky essays about my childhood. And I kind of realized that the quirky essays weren't getting to the heart of what mattered. And the heart of what mattered was this, you know, very interesting and unique childhood and all of these kind of racial things that formed this person I've become today. And also this kind of responsibility of, doing justice to these people, and especially our father, because like I said, my sister and brother were so young when he passed. So these kind of photograph memories that I have, they don't even have that. Or these blurry memories I have, they don't even have that. And a part of me really just wanted to, even if it never became a book, if it never went anywhere or sold or anything like that, I would have this kind of, recording of my memory of our childhood and this picture that I wanted to rebuild of our father, who my sister and brother didn't get to experience. And that was a big motivation for sure.
Stepping back, this book is a beautiful way to have a conversation about identity, about belonging. I imagine you hear that from readers a lot.
Yes, very much so. And it's interesting, talking to readers in Florida versus talking to readers in other parts of the country. I think it's interesting how few stories are written out of Southwest Florida. How few stories come out of Fort Myers in specific. So readers there are always kind of like, it's beautiful to see my hometown on the page, and to see it kind of accurately and honestly rendered as, hopefully I have in this book. And then to get outside of Florida and to connect with Filipino readers and Filipino-American readers and Asian American readers and, readers of all these kind of other classes that as we talked about, is even more fascinating to me, because I thought this story was so odd, and so different. And I didn't know that it would be, all that relatable necessarily, but there's just all these little aspects of it that people have been able to latch onto that I never, ever imagined possible.
Was there ever a moment of hesitation about sharing some of these personal stories?
Very much so, yeah. It's funny because if you take any kind of writing workshop or thing like that, they tell you just write the story that you need to write in the moment, and if it goes anywhere, you'll cross those bridges when you come to them. And so I did. I was very much like, okay, we're just going to write it as I remember it, imbue all those emotions that I remember into these scenes that I'm trying to cobble together and everything. And then the bridges come and you have to cross them, and you have to figure out, okay, how much of this story am I honestly willing to divulge? How much of this reality am I honestly willing to put out there? And, how can I understand the sacrifices that will mean of relationships or, my sister or brother talking to me ever again? And I was very careful. I was very careful to, one, be incredibly honest, but then to two, make sure that the people I cared about most were okay with that honesty, were okay with that being out there. And honestly, for me, that meant my sister and brother. They were the first people I went to kind of saying, if you're not okay with this, I can change things, I can alter things, I can have two brothers, I can have two sisters. It's memoir, it's not autobiography. There's room to play, I feel like, as long as you're being very honest with the emotions of this situation. And they both read it, and, I think my sister put it very nicely. She said, this is the story you had to write about our childhood. And I was like, okay, I can work with that.
Your mother was an amazing woman. She was smart, she was ambitious, she was complicated with a capital C.
Yes.
And something else that you wrote, and I believe I have this verbatim, parents are capable of serious soul-crushing harm. Now, my takeaway from that is that parents have their own stories that are separate from ours, and do we need to show grace?
Oh, I know, yeah. And how do you define grace? What is grace in these situations? And honestly, to me, I think grace was incredibly important. And for me, that kind of meant, being brutally honest, but not just about the bad times, about all the times, because there were wonderful times in there too. And there was reasons for the bad times. And they weren't always justified, and they weren't always, reasons that I would ever repeat with my own children, but there were reasons there. And I feel like for me, grace was painting a picture that had all of those reasons in it, and all of those motivations, and all of those textures and layers and things. Because my mother is so incredibly complicated, and she was so brilliant. To get to where she has, from where she came from, is not, it's an exponential leap for anybody. And I think that was a huge realization of, this woman who I was very willing to kind of like two-dimensionalize into this flattened, evil mom kind of role, was like, well, no, when you look at it, there's so much more there. And it's actually pretty remarkable if I can get over my own, preconceived notions of her,
And I think you learned that on your trip when you traveled
sure.
with your mother to the Philippines.
Yeah, that was honestly my favorite sections to write, were the Manila chapters. And for a while, like, this book had way too many words for a long time, and there was a whole like act that was like just devoted to that month the family spent in Manila when I was 11 years old after our dad died. Because it was revelatory, it was life-changing, like it was paradigm shifting. You grew up thinking like life is this, and then all of a sudden you're like, nope, there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and this whole world opened up to me of like that. This is not normal. Like, the life we have in the U.S. in so many ways is not normal, and that this mother I had in the U.S. is not all of her. It's not all of this person. That there's so much more personhood to my mom than just like raising 3 kids in Robert E. Lee County, Florida. There's so much more to her, and just the absolute mind-blowing nature of that trip is still for me. It shapes so much of who I am.
You spent a long time trying to define your own identity, and that is not unusual at all for multicultural children. What you also spent 18 years doing is being a food critic,
yes.
But you wrote under a different name.
Yeah.
You wrote under a name where people thought the writer was a man.
Yeah, a French guy. Yep.
Why a French man?
Right? Yeah, so I started writing restaurant reviews for the news press in 2005 or 6. Right in the mid-2000s. And I wrote the reviews under this pen name, Jean LeBouf, who many readers assumed was a man and, a white guy, a French guy. A lot of the letters were addressed to like Dear Monsieur LeBouf and like Cher LeBouf, things like that. And it was a name that had been at the paper, so it wasn't like I didn't create the name. I kind of inherited it. It started, I think the very first Jean LeBouf review ran in December of 1979. So it was a well-established kind of figure thing at our local newspaper for years and years and years before I took on the role. But I loved it. Like, I loved it because it meant not having to be me, it meant not having to have all these complications, because just to be this French food guy was like, oh, that's easy, versus like all the complications of like half Filipina, half Yugoslavian, but I'm not sure if it's Serbian or Montenegrin or Bosnian, that's complicated. But Jean LeBouf was the best thing ever, just to be like, and people took me seriously as him, which maybe they would have as myself, but I was not willing to take that risk because it was much easier just to be like, oh, well, he says it's good, so you should all think it's good too, or he says it's not good.
We trust Jean LeBouf.
Exactly. There was so much trust there in so many different ways. And I think for me, it was like, oh, like this is power, just to have people trust you without knowing you. And, like that was also kind of paradigm shifting.
Let's not forget about medical school. What happened there?
Yes, yeah. Well, as the daughter of an Asian mother, there are certain acceptable career paths, and one of them is medical school. And I was good at it, I was like good at math and good at science. And so I thought, like, okay, well, just do that. Like, it makes everybody happy, and that seems like a solid, reasonable path. And then I graduated and I took a year off and I traveled a lot. I think I read a couple of Anthony Bourdain books at the time, as one does. And I realized like I had really no desire to go to medical school. But I wasn't going to just not go. I was like, during the travels, I had been to Hawaii. I had been, other parts of the country. Around the world, and I was like, I loved Hawaii because it was the first time that me, this like 5'9" Hapa girl who's not quite Asian but not quite white, I fit in. Like, everyone looked like me in Hawaii, and I was like, well, I'm going to apply to the University of Hawaii Medical School, and if they accept me, then it's meant to be. Then I will have, the cards will show that I am meant to be a doctor. I didn't do any research. I was just like, if this is the plan, then we're following it. And I applied, and I realized later they accept like 12 out-of-state applicants every year. And I did not get accepted. The rejection letter arrived swiftly in a very thin envelope. And I was like, I took it as this like grand sign from the universe, like, you are not meant to go to medical school. You are meant to do something else because this one place rejected you. And yeah, so that was when I really delved into food. I had always loved cooking. Like cooking when I was a kid was just kind of a necessity that I had to learn. But as I got older, I kind of figured out just the power that's there when you know how to make a meal, when you know how to take these ingredients that, you know, alone are inedible and nothing, and you know how to put them together into something that not only feeds people, but kind of like connects people.
There is power there. There really is.
Yeah, I loved that.
Viewers have to read the book to get this reference, and you did bring it up just for a second earlier, but numbers are an obsession for you. How does that work? And do you have a favorite number?
Oh, I still do, yes. Favorite number is 49. Because, well, I didn't even learn this until later, but I was born at 9:49 in the morning. Also very obsessed with 9 because I was a September baby, so 9th month of the year. My father died when I was 9. I've always thought there's kind of something there. But it's funny because like I'm not a numerologist. Like I don't go beyond just these little coincidences of my own life. But yeah, I do think it was just a way to kind of make sense of this chaos. You know, it was a very chaotic childhood where not a lot of things added up, but I could sit there and, you know, count the dots on my comforter and it would add up to 9. And I could sit there and count the number of steps it took me to get from my bed to the door and from the door to the bathroom. And, you know, those are just my little ways of like making sense of this weird world that I was in.
What was the most difficult scene for you to write?
Oh yeah. I think that honestly the whiteout chapter where my father dies, I just saved that for a long time. And it's funny because I wrote a lot of this book between June and September of 2020, which I don't recommend waiting for a pandemic to write your traumatic childhood memories out onto paper. It's ill-advised at best, but we were there I was. And I had this kind of like, a lot of these memories were things that I hadn't touched in a very long time. And I was nervous, like what happens, you know, when you go into like the attic of your mind and start opening these boxes that you really haven't bothered to look at in years, if not decades. And I think when I started to, this kind of sense of urgency overwhelmed me where I was like, okay, well now you're looking at this scene, you're revisiting this childhood memory, you need to write it as fast as you can or else it's gonna be gone. And so I was careful. I was kind of just going through chronologically, you know, from like when my parents met to when I was born to when, you know, just kind of getting these things down on paper as fast as I could because I was very worried about forgetting them for some reason. And that was the one that I held off on. I was like, no, we're not going to write like the story of how specifically my father died until like I was ready for that. And it took a little while because that was like the one box that I was like, I don't know if I want to touch that. But I think as the rest of the story kind of like coalesced around that little hole, it like became apparent that I had to fill that hole in, you know, and that it was just one more thing that really added to how, you know, abnormal and how not regular I thought our family was. But I held on to that for a long time of just not kind of wanting to go there.
I can totally understand that after reading this, but because this book is so honest, you could not have left that part of your father's death out. Yes, writing a memoir has to be authentic. Yours is about as honest as it gets. Is there also something very cathartic in getting it out?
Yeah, I'm like, yes and no. I don't know, yeah, there is for sure. I think there was that fear of, you know, what is going to happen when I start looking into these boxes and start looking at these old memories. You know, I think that was very quickly replaced by this idea of like, oh gosh, like it doesn't hurt as much anymore. You know, like it's not as bad as it was when I was a kid going through these things. So that was a huge revelation. And then there was also this very unique opportunity to kind of go back to my childhood self and be like, it's all okay, you know? Like, look at us now, we're on we're on Anne's show, like, we're doing okay, you know? And I think that was a fantastic, like, kind of takeaway just to be able to like go to that little girl and be like, you're gonna be good. Like, it's gonna suck for a while, but you're gonna be good, you know?
Time does a number on us anyway, and when you revisited certain parts when you were writing them from the book, do you look at them differently?
Oh, I know, yeah. And so I do, yes, I do now. I think, you know, a lot of the book is in first person narration, a child's eye view of it all, which when I was replaying it all is how I saw it. It's genuinely how I remembered it, was, you know, being back in my childhood body and kind of seeing this like mind-boggling world around me. And I think the journalist in me wanted to stay true to that perspective of just like, here's what happened, here's how I experienced it. But there were times, and actually a lot of the editing process with my agent and my editor was like, we need to know what you think about this now. And so a lot of the edits that I had to do was kind of like breaking from that childhood perspective and going in as my adult self and being, you know, trying to make sense of these things and trying to rationalize these things, or at least just show, you know, how that childhood view has changed over the course of decades and over the course of a life lived.
Annabelle Tometich, it has been a delight to have you here today.
So fun. Thank you so much.
The book is The Mango Tree, a memoir of Fruit, Florida, and Felony. I'm Ann Bocock. Please join me on the next Between the Covers.